The townsfolk had seen many drifters, but none as silent or as burdened as the stranger who rode in that evening. The town of Dry Creek had lived in predictable rhythms for years. Each morning, the blacksmith's hammer rang like a clock. The saloon doors swung at the same hour when ranchers came for whiskey. Children ran dusty streets until their mothers called them home for supper. Nothing ever changed in Dry Creek. Not until the evening a lone rider appeared at the horizon, his silhouette sharp against the fading Sunday. He did not ride fast. His horse was tired, its steps heavy, as though carrying a weight beyond its own. Across the saddle, lashed down with iron clasps and worn leather straps, rested a chest. It was not large enough to hold a man, but not small enough to be ignored. The wood was dark, scarred with marks that suggested a violent past. Every clink of the iron against the saddle stirred unease in the townsfolk who watched from porches and windows. Dry Creek had seen strangers before hunters, ranch hands, wanderers chasing fortune, but this man carried something more than dust and weariness. His silence was a shroud, his eyes fixed ahead, giving no greeting, no nod, no gesture of acknowledgement. The chest was his only companion, and the way he clutched the reins with one hand while keeping the other close to it made the onlookers uneasy. At first, the townsfolk whispered about gold. A locked chest could mean hidden treasure, wages stolen from a railroad company, or perhaps winnings from a crooked poker game. Others muttered darker suspicions: guns, opium, even human remains. Mothers ushered their children indoors as the stranger passed, and the sheriff, standing on the boardwalk, narrowed his eyes, measuring the man in silence. The chest gave off no sound beyond the rattling of its iron frame, yet people swore they felt something about it, an energy, a weight in the air. Some said the horse seemed reluctant to bear it, its ears twitching nervously. Others claimed they heard faint scratching from within, though no one dared to get close enough to be sure. Curiosity grew, but with it came a ripple of fear, the kind that creeps into the bones before the mind can name it. Inside the saloon, speculation brewed faster than whiskey. Old Jacob, who had been in every gunfight within 100 miles, insisted it had to be stolen army gold. "That chest is heavy with more than iron," he muttered, eyes glinting with greed. Across the table, young Tom leaned closer, whispering, "What if it's not gold? What if he's carrying something cursed? Something that ain't meant for a man to touch?" Laughter followed, but even the laughter carried unease, a nervousness that no one could shake. As the stranger tethered his horse outside the boarding house, he lifted the chest down with both arms, muscles straining though he bore it with practiced care. He set it on the ground as though it were alive, as though sudden movement might wake it. Mrs. Larkin, who ran the boarding house, stepped onto the porch, folding her arms. "Room's $1 a night," she said firmly. The stranger gave a single nod, reached into his coat, and handed her silver coins without a word. Not once did his gaze lift from the chest. That night, lanterns burned longer in Dry Creek. Families spoke of the rider in hushed tones. Some wanted to approach him, to pry open the mystery. Others urged the sheriff to run him out before trouble followed. The chest divided the town before its lock was ever touched. Behind shuttered windows, suspicion grew into stories, and stories into fear. In the quiet hours, when the wind swept through the dirt streets, more than one witness claimed they saw the stranger moving the chest inside his room, shifting it from corner to corner, as though testing the floorboards. One boy swore he saw him kneel beside it, whispering words too faint to hear, his hands pressed against the lid as if holding something inside. By morning, half the town was convinced the chest was more than wood and iron. The sheriff, a man not easily rattled, walked the length of Main Street the next day, his boots striking slow, deliberate steps. He knew what unchecked suspicion could do. Dry Creek had seen violence before, not from outlaws but from its own people when fear twisted into anger. His eyes followed the boarding house where the chest now rested upstairs. He told himself it was just a box, nothing more. But in his gut, he felt the weight of something different, something that did not belong. By sundown, men gathered again at the saloon, voices sharper, greed and fear mixing like bad liquor. Some argued that if treasure lay inside, It was their right to claim it. Others said the stranger was dangerous, that no man guarded a chest so fiercely without reason. Women hushed their children to bed early, locking doors that had not seen a bolt in years. The town that had been steady as the seasons now felt fragile, its peace cracking under the weight of a silent traveler. And still, the stranger said nothing. He went about his business quietly, eating alone, sleeping little, never letting the chest out of reach. His silence was more unsettling than anger would have been. He was a man apart, not asking for trust, not offering explanation. He was a shadow passing through, and yet somehow, the town knew he had come for a reason. The boarding house creaked under the desert night, and from behind closed shutters, townsfolk watched the upstairs window glow with lamplight. Every movement of the shadow within kept them restless. Every thought circled back to the chest. What was it holding? Why had he brought it here? And why, of all the towns in the wide and empty West, had he chosen Dry Creek? The town would learn soon enough, but the answer would come at a cost none of them could have foreseen. Whispers turned to questions when the stranger refused to speak of the chest or of himself. By the second morning, Dry Creek was no longer simply curious. The town was restless. A man could ride through in silence, stay a night, and leave without anyone caring. But this stranger was different. He ate in silence, walked in silence, and even when spoken to, his words, when they came at all, were short, clipped, as though each syllable was too costly to spend. At the boarding house dining table, Mrs. Larkin served him eggs and biscuits, her eyes darting to the chest that rested at his side even as he ate. "Stranger, where you headed after this?" she asked, her tone polite but her curiosity sharp. The man chewed, swallowed, and answered only, "West." No more, no less. He lifted his coffee, stared into the black liquid, and said nothing else. Mrs. Larkin pursed her lips. For her, the silence was worse than rudeness. Soon, others tried their hand. The blacksmith, a broad man with soot in his beard, leaned on his hammer when the stranger walked past. "Chest like that must hold something mighty fine," he said with a half-smile, the kind that invited an answer. But the stranger only adjusted the strap on his horse and walked on. His lack of acknowledgement was an insult in a town where men measured one another by the weight of their words. Sheriff Calder watched all this quietly. He had been sheriff long enough to know that silence spoke louder than noise. A guilty man often rambled, spilling too many explanations. An innocent man defended himself quickly, but this stranger offered nothing at all. Calder's eyes followed the man's hands, scarred, rough, with a slight tremor when he brushed past the chest, as though touching it calmed him. He noticed the way the man's shoulders stiffened when anyone drew near, the way his eyes scanned exits before sitting in a room. These were not the habits of a simple traveler. These were the instincts of someone who had lived too long in danger. At the saloon, attempts to pry him open continued. Old Jacob, who thrived on stories, sidled up to the bar where the stranger sat alone. "You've carried that chest far, haven't you?" Jacob said, swirling his drink. "Looks heavy. Bet there's gold in it. Or maybe secrets worth more than gold." He chuckled, waiting for a reaction, but the stranger merely lifted his glass, drank, and set it down again, eyes forward. Jacob tried again, louder this time. "Name's Jacob. You got a name, stranger?" A pause stretched so long the air itself seemed to tighten. Finally, the stranger replied, his voice low and even. "A name doesn't change what's in the chest." The saloon grew still at that, and Jacob's smile faltered. The man had given an answer without giving anything at all, and somehow it only deepened the mystery. Others tried different methods. A rancher offered him work, hoping conversation might follow. A gambler tried to lure him into a card game, curious to see if his silence would break under pressure. One bold drifter even offered him money, a few silver coins, in exchange for a glimpse inside the chest. Each attempt ended the same, with the stranger's quiet refusal, his body angled protectively toward the chest, his face unreadable. It was not anger that stopped them, it was indifference, as if their words meant nothing. The sheriff's suspicion deepened with every encounter. Calder began to ask himself the same questions the town whispered. Who was this man? What had he seen that carved such hardness into his eyes? The scars on his knuckles spoke of fights won and lost. The faint notch near his jaw suggested a knife had once come close. And yet, for all the hints of violence, the stranger carried himself not with recklessness, but with restraint. He did not provoke, did not strike, did not even raise his voice. It was as though his whole being was bent on one purpose, keeping that chest safe. By the third evening, Dry Creek was a town of rumors. Some swore the man had been an outlaw, carrying stolen wages from a bloody raid. Others insisted he had once been a soldier, the chest filled with war spoils or grim trophies. A few whispered darker theories, that it held a disease, a relic, or even the remains of someone he had wronged. Each version of the story fed the town's unease, and the unease only sharpened the sheriff's watchful eye. Calder decided to test the man himself. He approached him outside the saloon, his voice steady. "You've been in town long enough, stranger. Folks are talking. Makes me wonder why you're so quiet about what you're carrying." The stranger looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time the sheriff saw something flicker in his eyes, pain, sharp and fleeting, like a wound reopening. But just as quickly it was gone. "What I carry," the stranger said softly, "is mine, nothing more." His tone was not hostile, but final, like the slamming of a door. Calder felt the weight of the words, but what unsettled him most was the way the man's hand brushed the chest again, tenderly, almost like a father's touch to a child. The sheriff didn't press him further, but as he walked away, his mind churned. A man who guarded silence that fiercely was either protecting himself or protecting others from something worse. The thought lodged deep in Calder's gut, heavy and unwelcome. Night fell again on Dry Creek, and behind drawn curtains, families spoke of leaving. Men sharpened knives and checked revolvers. Women clutched children closer. The stranger had not harmed a soul, and yet the town was changing around him. Fear was not loud, it was quiet, creeping, spreading, and it was all because of one man and his locked chest. In his upstairs room, the stranger sat by the window, the chest before him, lamplight flickering across his scarred face. His eyes were distant, his breath heavy. Outside, the sheriff stood beneath the same window, hat brim low, hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Neither spoke, neither moved. The night held its breath. What secret could be worth such silence, and what price would the town pay to uncover it? It wasn't just the chest that unsettled people, it was the way the stranger guarded it, even in his sleep. By the fourth night, the town of Dry Creek had begun to feel like a place under siege. Though no outlaw gang had ridden in, no storm had swept across the plains, the danger was quieter, coiled in the shape of one man, and the chest he refused to part with. The stranger never let it leave his sight. He carried it down to the boarding house's dining room at breakfast and kept it beside him when he ate. When he walked the street, it was strapped across his saddle, one hand always within reach. Even in the saloon, where men usually shed burdens at the door, he sat with the chest against his boot, his leg hooked protectively around it. And at night, when others finally drifted into uneasy sleep, faint lantern glow from his room showed his silhouette hunched beside it, never fully resting. The image spread through the town, a man and his chest, bound together like flesh and bone, and with every sighting, suspicion deepened. Children, with their reckless boldness, turned the fear into a game. One dared another to touch it when the stranger left it briefly outside his room to fetch water. A boy, no more than 10, crept forward on bare feet, his hand trembling as he stretched toward the iron latch. Just as his fingers grazed the wood, the door swung open. The stranger stood there, his eyes hollow, his hand gripping the boy's wrist with terrifying speed. No words came, only silence, but the boy swore afterward that the man's grip felt like iron shackles, unbreakable. The child ran home in tears, and from that moment on, parents warned their children to keep distance not from the chest, but from the man who guarded it. Rumors took on new life. Some said the chest held stolen weapons, bound for a war nobody wanted to think about. Others whispered it was filled with government papers, secrets worth killing over. The most popular tale, though, was gold, Confederate gold, Union payroll, or bandit loot. buried and unearthed again. Men with thin purses and empty farms leaned closer to those stories, greed sparking in their eyes. Greed, after all, was more dangerous than fear. In the saloon, the talk grew sharper. "No man guards a chest like that unless it's worth dying for," muttered one ranch hand, slamming his drink on the counter. "And if it's worth dying for, it's worth taking." Others shook their heads, warning against it. They had seen the stranger's scars, the tension in his shoulders, the practiced way his hands hovered near his belt. He might not speak, but he was no man to trifle with. Still, liquor loosened tongues, and before long, the promise of treasure spread faster than reason. Sheriff Calder felt the shift more than anyone. He had watched towns crack before under hunger, under drought, under the cruel hand of outlaws. But this was different. This was a town tearing itself apart over the weight of a box they hadn't even opened. Calder sat in his office, staring at the glow from the boarding house window, the shape of the stranger's lantern flickering against the curtains. He thought of the boy's story, of the trembling hand that had nearly touched the chest, and he weighed his duty. Was it his role to step in now, before blood was shed, or was the man within his rights to guard what belonged to him? The law said one thing, but the people's fear demanded another. Calder leaned back in his chair, his revolver resting on the desk beside him, and wondered which would collapse first, the lock on that chest, or the patience of his town. The next morning brought more fuel to the fire. A merchant swore he heard noises from within the chest, scraping, shuffling, like something alive struggling to get free. Others scoffed, saying it was only the imagination of a man who drank too much. But the tale spread quickly, and soon, even those who didn't believe found themselves waking in the night, ears straining for sounds that weren't there. By now, the stranger's presence had become unbearable. He hadn't harmed a soul, hadn't drawn his weapon, hadn't broken a law, and yet, men sat at their kitchen tables with clenched fists, wives whispered of leaving, and children peeked through shutters in fear. The chest was no longer just his, it belonged to the town's imagination, and imagination was a dangerous thing. That evening, Sheriff Calder stood outside the boarding house, hat low, his face shadowed by lamplight. Inside, the stranger sat with the chest at his feet, the firelight casting long lines across his scarred hands. Calder watched through the window, torn. He could wait, let the town's anger swell until it burst, or he could act, take the chest into custody, and risk making himself the man who opened the door to whatever secret it held. The stranger, sensing eyes on him, looked up. His gaze met the sheriff's through the window. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Calder saw exhaustion there, but also defiance, an unspoken warning that the chest would not be surrendered easily. The lawman stepped back into the shadows, his mind unsettled. Dry Creek was a tinderbox, and the chest was the spark. One wrong word, one rash hand reaching where it shouldn't, and the whole town might ignite. And in that fragile silence, Calder realized the truth: one wrong move could set the whole town against him. By the third night, the town was no longer curious, it was afraid. The boarding house had grown quiet that evening, but not the kind of quiet that comes with peace. It was the silence of a place holding its breath, listening for something it did not want to hear. Behind thin walls, families lay awake, straining against the dark. From the stranger's room upstairs came noises no one could explain. Metallic clangs echoed in uneven intervals, followed by muffled thuds, as though the chest were shifting on its own. Sometimes the sound was faint, like nails dragging across wood. Other times it rattled so sharply that Mrs. Larkin swore her dishes shook in the cupboard. People told themselves it must be the stranger moving it, dragging it across the floorboards. But the rhythm was unnatural, too irregular, as though something inside was pushing back. By dawn, stories spread across town. Some said they heard chains clinking. Others whispered of scratching, like an animal desperate to claw its way out. Each version was retold with more dread than the last. Even the animals sensed something. Horses stabled near the boarding house kicked against their stalls at night, snorting and sweating as though spooked by a predator. Dogs refused to walk past the building, ears pinned flat, growling low at the second-floor window where the chest Saturday. A mule, tied too close to the porch, had broken free in the middle of the night, nearly strangling itself on the rope in its panic. These were not the reactions of beasts to ordinary wood and iron. By the third morning, Dry Creek felt different. The air was heavy, like the town itself carried the weight of the chest. People gathered outside the general store, their voices sharp, their patience thinning. One man spat into the dirt. That stranger brought trouble with him. You hear it same as I do. Whatever's in that chest ain't meant to be here. Another added, we should drive him out before it's too late. Heads nodded, but not all in agreement. A few men, greed still stronger than fear, argued the opposite. If the chest was dangerous, then it must hold something of value. Gold don't come easy, Jacob muttered, his eyes burning. Maybe that's why it makes noise. Maybe it's the sound of riches waiting for the man bold enough to take it. The argument that followed split the crowd, those who wanted the chest gone for good, and those who wanted it opened at any cost. The divide seeped into homes as well. Husbands and wives quarreled over whether to leave town or wait to see what happened. Friends who had drunk together for years now eyed one another with suspicion. The chest was no longer just the stranger's burden, it was Dry Creek's curse, one that forced neighbors to take sides. Sheriff Calder felt the weight of that divide more than anyone. From his office, he watched as men gathered in knots on the street, their whispers carrying like smoke. He had tried to keep the peace through patience, but patience was running dry. His deputies asked what they should do if the town rose against the stranger. Calder had no answer. He was sworn to uphold the law, but what law covered a chest that unsettled the very animals, that filled decent people with such dread? That night, the noises grew louder. Mrs. Larkin swore she heard the chest shift on its own, scraping hard against the floorboards while the stranger sat motionless beside it. Other boarders fled the house entirely, choosing to sleep outside on the hard ground rather than stay under the same roof. Fear spread like fire, quiet but consuming. A group of men gathered near the saloon after midnight, their nerves fueled by whiskey. If the sheriff won't act, we will, one growled. They spoke of dragging the stranger into the street, of throwing the chest into the river, of forcing answers from a man who gave none. But others hesitated, remembering the stranger's scars, the way his eyes cut through a room. Violence against such a man would not come cheap. Sheriff Calder broke up the gathering before fists turned into guns, but he saw the truth in their eyes. The town was a powder keg, and the chest was the fuse. He returned to his office, sat heavily at his desk, and stared into the dark. His hand rested on his revolver, but he did not draw it. Instead, he thought of the stranger's silence, the pain flickering in his eyes, and the strange tenderness with which he touched the chest. The sheriff's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong, more wrong than even the townsfolk feared. But was it his place to intervene? If he seized the chest, he might unleash something worse. If he did nothing, the town might erupt in violence against the stranger, and he would have blood on his hands. Either choice threatened to shatter Dry Creek. By dawn, the town had reached its breaking point. Mothers refused to send their children outside. Men stood with rifles on porches, guarding against a threat they could not name. The stranger walked the street once more, chest strapped to his saddle, and every eye followed him, some with fear, some with greed, all with suspicion. The sheriff stood on the boardwalk, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He watched the stranger ride slowly past, watched the way his hand rested on the chest, and felt the pressure of the town's gaze shift toward him. They were waiting for him to act, for him to break the silence, for him to decide whether the chest stayed or went. And as the dust settled behind the stranger's horse, the question hung heavy over Dry Creek. What was the sheriff waiting for? The sheriff had seen plenty of secrets in his life, but never one that unsettled an entire town. Sheriff Calder was no stranger to silence. He had seen men keep their mouths shut to save their pride, their families, even their necks. But he had never seen a silence like this one that spread like an infection, slipping into every corner of a town until even children whispered when they spoke of it. Dry Creek was unraveling, and the stranger's locked chest sat at the center like a stone in still water, sending ripples farther than anyone had thought possible. By the fifth evening, Calder could no longer wait. He had watched the town split, watched neighbors argue, watched fear crawl into homes that once carried only laughter and routine. And now, standing in the middle of Main Street with half the town gathered on porches and in doorways, he decided it was time to confront the man who had brought this darkness with him. The stranger rode into town slow as ever, the chest lashed to his saddle, his face carved in the same mask of indifference. Calder stepped down from the boardwalk and planted himself in the rider's path. Dust swirled around his boots. The townsfolk went still, the kind of stillness that comes when people sense a storm breaking. "Stranger," Calder said, his voice carrying across the street, calm but firm. "You've been here long enough. Folks want to know what you're carrying that keeps them awake at night." The rider pulled his horse to a stop. For a moment, he simply stared at the sheriff, eyes dark under the brim of his hat. The silence stretched so long that people shifted uneasily, whispering to one another. Finally, the man dismounted, boots landing heavy in the dirt. He stood face to face with Calder, the chest between them like a drawn line in the sand. "What I carry is mine," the stranger said at last. His tone was low, steady, but there was no warmth in it, no explanation, no apology, only finality. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Calder held his ground, though his jaw tightened. "Maybe so," he replied, "but when what you carry unsettles an entire town, the law has reason to step in." The man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his gaze swept the crowd. Dozens of townsfolk stared back, some with fear, some with anger, some with greed. Whatever they saw in his expression made them uneasy. It was not the look of guilt, nor the look of a liar caught in his story. It was something colder, something that suggested he had already decided how far he would go to protect what was his. People drew back, muttering nervously. Even without moving, the stranger's presence carried the weight of a loaded gun. Later that night, tension boiled over at the saloon. Men who had been whispering their theories for days finally let liquor loosen their tongues. Jacob slammed his glass down. "We sit here like fools while that man keeps his secrets under lock and key. Gold, guns, whatever it is, he don't deserve to guard it alone." Another rancher shouted back. "Or maybe he's cursed us all just by bringing it here. You want to open it? Go ahead, but don't drag me down with you." The shouting grew louder, fists clenched, and chairs scraped against the floor. In the corner, the stranger sat silent, the chest under his boot, as always. His presence alone was a spark. One man staggered toward him, jabbing a finger in his direction. "Let's see what's in that box. Or are you too scared to show it?" Before another word could be spoken, a hand shot out. The stranger's stare locked on the drunk, and though he barely moved, the look alone was enough to freeze the man mid-step. The saloon quieted as if someone had drawn a gun. It wasn't violence the stranger offered, it was a stare so cold that it stripped the bravado from men's voices. One by one, eyes dropped. The fight drained out of the room, but the tension lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Sheriff Calder arrived not long after, drawn by the raised voices spilling onto the street. He pushed through the swinging doors, surveying the uneasy faces, then looked to the corner where the stranger sat unmoving. The chest rested at his feet, as unyielding as its owner. Calder's hand brushed the butt of his revolver not in threat, but in warning. "Stranger," he said, voice firm, "this town's holding itself together by threads. If you think the law will shield you while you sit silent, you're wrong. Folks are near their breaking point, and when they break, I may not be able to hold them back." The stranger lifted his gaze, unflinching, as if weighing the sheriff's words. For a heartbeat, Calder thought he saw something behind the man's eyes, not arrogance, not defiance, but a deep, weary sorrow. It passed quickly, and the mask returned. The man said nothing. The sheriff let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of every watching eye. He knew his words had planted themselves in the stranger's mind, but he also knew they had unsettled the town even more. If the law could not make the man speak, then perhaps only violence would. That thought kept Calder's stomach heavy as he stepped back into the night air. Behind him, the saloon hummed with low, fearful murmurs. The people of Dry Creek no longer saw the chest as just a curiosity. It was now a danger, a threat to their safety and their sanity, and if the sheriff would not act soon, someone else surely would. As Calder walked into the darkened street, one question pressed harder than the desert heat. Would he uphold the law, or break it for the town's safety? Tension snapped when greed found its voice. Dry Creek had always been a town of whispers, but by the sixth night, whispers hardened into schemes. Fear had divided neighbors, but greed united them in dark corners. Men who had once shared drinks at the saloon now gathered behind closed doors, their words sharp and desperate. For days they had watched the stranger guard his chest as though his life depended on it. To some, that was proof enough of its value. If the sheriff would not act, then they would. The plan was simple, or so they told themselves. Wait until midnight, when the town was still. Slip into the boarding house. Take the chest. Divide its contents before sunrise. The stranger, they reasoned, was only one man, weary from travel, stretched thin by sleepless nights. 5 determined men against one silent drifter that was no contest, or so they believed. The moon hung low, veiled in thin clouds, when the group crept across the dirt street. Their boots were wrapped in rags to muffle their steps. They carried knives, a crowbar, and a rope. The air was heavy with nervous breath as they eased open the boarding house door. Inside, the building creaked with the sound of men moving where they did not belong. Upstairs, a dim lantern glow marked the stranger's room. Jacob, who had pushed hardest for this, raised a hand for silence. Step by step, they climbed the stairs, each board groaning like a warning. They reached the door. The chest's shadow stretched long across the lamplight under the crack. Jacob pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing, no footsteps, no movement. He nodded. The crowbar slid between the latch and the frame, prying carefully. The lock gave with a snap, loud as thunder in the midnight stillness. For a heartbeat, the men froze. Then Jacob shoved the door open. What they saw stopped them cold. The stranger was awake, seated in a chair with the chest at his feet, as if he had been waiting for them. His revolver lay across his lap, one scarred hand resting on the handle. His eyes met theirs, calm, steady, and without surprise. The room seemed smaller in that instant, the air heavier, the danger sharper than any blade. Jacob tried to speak, but before words came, the stranger moved. The revolver barked once, a warning shot that buried itself in the doorframe inches from a man's head. The sound tore through the house, rattling windows. One man dropped his knife, another stumbled back, heart pounding. Still, the stranger did not fire again. He rose slowly, towering in silence, and stepped forward. His hand struck Jacob across the jaw with such force that he crumpled to the floor. Another lunged, swinging his crowbar, but the stranger caught his wrist, twisted, and sent the weapon clattering across the room. A third man tried to draw his own pistol, but the stranger's boot caught him in the chest, slamming him against the wall. Breathless, it was not chaos, it was control. Every move was precise, deliberate, the violence measured. The stranger proved not only that he was dangerous, but that he had chosen restraint. He could have killed them all in an instant, but he didn't. Instead, he left them writhing on the floor, beaten, but alive. "You'll leave it," the stranger said, his voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. "This chest doesn't belong to you. Touch it again, and I'll end you." His eyes swept across the broken men, and none doubted the truth in his words. The intruders scrambled from the room, dragging Jacob by his collar, stumbling down the stairs like frightened children. The sound of their retreat echoed into the street, and soon half the town was awake, lanterns glowing in windows, whispers carrying the news. 5 men had gone to take the chest. None had returned with it, and though blood had not been spilled, the town now knew what the stranger was capable of. Sheriff Calder arrived minutes later, drawn by the gunshot and the commotion. He found the boarding house porch crowded with nervous townsfolk, their faces pale in the lantern light. Inside, the stranger stood in his doorway, revolver holstered, chest untouched. Calder looked at him hard, then at the bruised men being nursed by their wives, and felt the weight settle in his gut. This was no ordinary drifter, A man does not sit waiting for thieves with his revolver ready unless he knows they're coming. A man does not fight like that without years of practice, years of survival carved into his bones. Calder realized then that the stranger was not merely guarding treasure. He was guarding something larger, something that could not be stolen with knives and crowbars. The sheriff stepped closer, lowering his voice so only the stranger could hear. "You can't keep this up," he said. "These people won't stop. And next time, they'll come with more than rags on their boots and kitchen knives." The stranger's eyes flicked toward the chest, then back to Calder. For the first time, there was no defiance, no indifference, only a flicker of exhaustion and something else the sheriff could not name. "They don't understand what they're asking for," the stranger murmured. Calder's jaw tightened. "Then make them understand, or I'll have no choice but to step in myself." The stranger said nothing more. He shut the door, leaving Calder on the landing, listening to the faint scrape of the lock sliding into place. Outside, the town buzzed with restless fear. Men muttered about the beating, some angry, some ashamed. Women urged their husbands to leave it be, to stay away from the man who fought like a soldier and spared no mercy. Yet others whispered darker plans, convinced the chest's worth must be greater than ever if 5 men had risked their lives for it. Sheriff Calder stood in the street, lantern light casting long shadows. He could feel the weight of the town pressing on him, demanding action. But deep inside, he understood something the others did not. The chest was not merely a prize. It was a burden, and the man who carried it had done so too long and too hard to ever let it go. If the sheriff didn't act soon, blood would spill not by accident, but by certainty. The chest was no longer an object, it was a shadow hanging over every household. By the 7th day, the chest had seeped into every conversation, every glance, every silence. It no longer sat only at the stranger's feet, it lived in the homes of Dry Creek, in the space between words spoken at supper tables, in the uneasy stares traded across dusty streets. Families who once argued over small matters, money, crops, chores, now quarreled over whether to stay or leave, whether to mind their own business or pry open another man's secret. Mrs. Larkin, who had run the boarding house with steady hands for years, confessed to her sister that she thought of sending her children east. "It ain't natural," she whispered, gripping her apron. "Since that chest came, I don't sleep. I hear it in my dreams like it's calling." Her sister urged her to stay, saying she was imagining things, but the fear was real, and it gnawed at her like hunger. Elsewhere, rancher families argued bitterly. Some fathers claimed the chest promised wealth enough to settle debts, to buy land, to start fresh. Their wives saw only ruin, only violence waiting at the door. In one home, a husband stormed into the night with his rifle, vowing to claim the chest before another man did. His wife locked the door behind him and prayed he would never return. Even friendships began to crack. At the saloon, partners who had shared business for years now distrusted one another. One man accused the other of secretly plotting to seize the chest without him. Shouts turned to fists, and blood stained the sawdust floor. When the sheriff broke them apart, their friendship was gone, shattered beyond repair. The chest divided couples, partners, even brothers. It was no longer just wood and iron, it was temptation, fear, and greed distilled into a single shape. Its weight pressed on everyone, even those who had never laid eyes on it. Sheriff Calder felt that weight heavier than all. His badge, once a shield of certainty, now felt like a chain around his neck. The law told him the chest was the stranger's property. The people told him it was a danger. Every day he walked Main Street. He felt eyes following him, measuring whether he was strong enough to act. His deputies urged him to seize the chest and lock it in the jailhouse for safety. But Calder knew that would not silence the town. It would only fan the flames. The sheriff's nights grew longer. He sat in his office, lantern burning low, listening to the faint sounds that carried across town. Horses kicking their stalls, dogs barking at shadows, and always, the whisper of fear. He imagined himself standing before the chest, key in hand, with the whole town behind him demanding answers. If he opened it, what would spill out? Gold? bones, or something that could not be locked away again? Meanwhile, the stranger himself began to change. He had carried his silence like armor since the day he arrived, but now cracks showed through. He paced more often, his eyes darting to the horizon as though he expected someone or something to follow. His hands trembled when he set them on the chest, not from fear of losing it, but from something deeper, something heavier. One night, Mrs. Larkin swore she heard him speaking softly to the chest, words she couldn't understand. Another boarder saw him staring at the stars, lips moving in prayer, or perhaps in warning, and when Sheriff Calder asked him once more if he knew the danger he'd brought to Dry Creek, the stranger only said, "It won't be long now." The words spread quickly, passed from mouth to mouth until they twisted into prophecy. Not long now, what did it mean? A deadline? An ending? Did the stranger carry something that would soon reveal itself, with or without a key? The uncertainty gnawed at the town worse than any rumor before. Dry Creek's streets grew emptier as families packed wagons under cover of night. But for every family that fled, another stayed, convinced that leaving meant forfeiting whatever reward the chest might bring. The divide was no longer just whispers, it was visible, carved into the very shape of the town, half ready to fight for survival, half ready to fight for fortune. And still, Calder stood in the middle, torn between two impossible choices. If he acted as the law demanded, he would defend the stranger's right to keep the chest. If he acted as peace demanded, he would take it away, break it open, and risk unleashing whatever secret lay inside. Each day he waited. Each day he chose silence. He felt the town slipping further toward ruin. One evening, Calder walked past the boarding house and saw the stranger sitting alone on the porch, chest beside him. The man's face was drawn, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky burned red with sunset. Calder paused, feeling the urge to speak, to demand the truth once and for all. But the stranger spoke first, his voice low, weary. "They'll come for it again," he said. "And next time, they won't leave alive." Calder's blood chilled. There was no threat in the man's tone, only certainty. The sheriff realized then that the town's clock was ticking, that the stranger's restlessness was not born of fear but of inevitability. Something was coming, and the chest was at the heart of it. That night, Calder lay awake, his revolver on the desk beside him, staring at the ceiling as the town around him fractured. In every home, in every bed, in every whispered argument, the chest loomed. It was not just an object anymore, it was time itself, counting down toward something none of them could escape. And as dawn broke over Dry Creek, the question spread like wildfire through every fearful heart: was time running out for everyone? The sheriff finally made his choice, and it would mark the beginning of the end. Sheriff Calder had reached the breaking point. For nights, the chest had haunted his sleep, its weight pressing on him as surely as it pressed on the stranger who guarded it. He had waited, hoping the tension would ease, that the town would settle itself before violence tore through it. But the time for waiting had passed. Families were leaving, neighbors no longer trusted one another, and whispers had turned to threats. Dry Creek was bleeding from within, and Calder could no longer stand idle. On the 8th evening, the sheriff walked down Main Street with his badge shining in the fading Sunday. His deputies flanked him, rifles in hand. Lanterns flickered in windows as townsfolk leaned out to watch, sensing something long delayed was about to break loose. Calder's steps were steady, but his jaw was tight. He had chosen law over silence, action over waiting. He was going to take the chest. The stranger sat on the boarding house porch, as he often did, the chest at his side. He looked up when the sheriff approached, his expression unreadable, though there was no surprise in his eyes. Perhaps he had been expecting this. Perhaps he had known it would come from the moment he rode into town. "Stranger," Calder said, his voice low but carrying across the street, "it ends tonight. That chest is coming with me." For the first time, the man's mask cracked. His hand tightened on the wood, his scarred fingers curling against the iron edge. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice rough, weary but edged with steel. "I understand enough," Calder replied. "You've turned this town inside out. You've brought division and fear with you. The law won't protect you if you keep it any longer. The stranger rose slowly to his feet, his body taut as a drawn bow. His eyes swept the gathering crowd, men with rifles, women clutching children, even old men who should have been home but now stood watching. His stare settled back on the sheriff. "If you take it," he said, his voice low, "you'll unleash what can't be." Caged again. Calder's hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "That's a risk I'll carry." The street went silent as the deputies moved forward. One reached for the chest, but the stranger's boot came down on it hard, anchoring it to the porch. His other hand hovered near his weapon, and the moment stretched razor-thin. For an instant, it seemed the street might erupt in gunfire. Mothers pulled their children back. Men raised rifles, and the sheriff's heart hammered in his chest. But then, the stranger's hand dropped. He did not draw. Instead, he lifted the chest himself, muscles straining, and set it down hard at his feet. "If you take it," he repeated, "the blood won't be on my hands." The deputies surged forward, wresting it from his grip. The man resisted, his body twisting like a cornered wolf, but he was outnumbered. The struggle sent dust flying, boots scraping across the porch, grunts of effort filling the tense air. At last, the deputies pried it from him, their shoulders heaving as they hauled the chest down the steps. The crowd surged closer, breathless. For the first time, they saw the chest stripped from the man who had guarded it so fiercely, and the sight shook them. Some cheered, convinced justice was finally being done. Others recoiled, dread spreading through them at the thought of what they had just taken from him. The stranger collapsed to one knee, his chest heaving. His eyes followed the deputies as they carried his burden into the street. He looked smaller without it, not in size, but in spirit, as if a piece of him had been ripped away. Yet even then, his voice cut through the crowd. "Don't open it," he said. His words, though spoken softly, carried like a gunshot in the tense silence. "Whatever you think it holds, you're wrong. If you break that lock, it won't be gold or riches you find. It'll be the end of this town." The murmurs began instantly, spreading like wildfire. Some scoffed, saying his words were meant only to frighten them into returning it. Others shifted uneasily, wondering if the warning carried truth. The chest gleamed in the torchlight, heavy with secrets, and the crowd could not tear their eyes from it. Sheriff Calder stood above the stranger, his hand still near his revolver. "Why should we believe you now?" he asked. "You've given nothing but silence. If you cared about this town, you would have spoken sooner." The stranger lifted his gaze, his eyes hollow and pained. "Because words wouldn't have changed anything. You only believe what you can hold in your hands. But some things," he broke off, his jaw tightening, "some things should never be touched." A hush fell across the street. Men shifted uneasily. Women clutched their children tighter. The chest sat heavy in the deputy's arms, and even those who had clamored loudest for it now seemed reluctant to approach. Yet the hunger for answers was stronger than fear. Sheriff Calder's voice cut the silence. "It's too late for warnings. This chest will be held under the law until I decide otherwise. And if there's truth to what you say, stranger, then God help us all." The deputies moved toward the jailhouse, the crowd trailing after them like moths to a flame. The stranger remained kneeling on the porch, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed, not on the sheriff, not on the people, but on the chest as it disappeared down the street. He looked like a man watching his last defense crumble, like someone who had carried a burden too long and now feared the world would share in its weight. And as his voice echoed one final time, "Don't open it," the town was left with a question that burned hotter than gold. Why would he beg them not to know the truth? The chest sat in the jailhouse, heavier with fear than with iron. The chest now belonged to the law, but it did not feel like a victory. Sheriff Calder stood alone in the jailhouse, staring at the box that had consumed his town. The deputies had carried it inside with grunts and curses, but when they set it down on the wooden floor, none would linger near it. They muttered excuses, claiming duties elsewhere, leaving Calder in the lamplight with the burden no one dared touch. It was unlike any chest he had seen in his years of service. The iron bands were too thick, too deliberate, etched with grooves that looked less like decoration and more like symbols. Strange marks ran across the lid, carved deep into the wood patterns that seemed to form and dissolve as the shadows shifted. Calder leaned closer, tracing them with his eyes, not his fingers. They reminded him of maps, or perhaps scars, something made to last, something made to be remembered. The lock itself was no common piece of work. It was large, iron-heavy, with a keyhole unlike any he'd seen. Not circular, but jagged, as though it required a key crafted for no other purpose. Calder had seen locks broken, locks picked, locks shattered, but this one seemed designed not just to keep men out, but to keep something in. Word spread quickly. By morning, half the town stood outside the jailhouse, pressing against the barred windows, demanding answers. Some shouted for Calder to open it, to reveal what had poisoned their homes and broken their peace. Others cried for him to burn it, to bury it, to drive it out of town before it swallowed them all. Their voices rose and tangled, echoing off the clapboard walls, until the jailhouse itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their fear. Inside, the chest sat silent, but its silence was louder than the crowd. The stranger, stripped of his burden, now sat behind iron bars. His hands rested on his knees, his head bowed, his face unreadable. He had not spoken since the chest was taken from him. The deputies had dragged him into the cell, expecting resistance, but he had given none. His surrender was worse than defiance. It felt less like defeat and more like acceptance, as though he had always known the moment would come. Calder approached the cell. "You want to tell me now?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You warned us not to open it. You begged us. Why?" The stranger lifted his head. His eyes, hollow and tired, met the sheriff's, but he did not answer. He simply leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, as if the choice was no longer his to make. The silence cut deeper than words. Calder turned back to the chest, his throat dry. He thought of the families arguing in their homes, of the men ready to spill blood, of the women packing wagons under cover of night. He thought of the boy who had nearly touched the chest days ago, and how close the town had come to disaster even then. The people deserved peace. They deserved the truth. But at what cost? That night, Calder remained alone in the jailhouse long after the crowd dispersed. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The chest seemed to breathe in that light, the grooves and marks on its surface shifting as though alive. He reached for the chain of keys at his belt, fingers brushing against the one newly cut for the jagged lock. The metal was cool, sharp-edged, pressing into his palm like a decision that could not be undone. His mind churned. The law was clear. Property seized in the interest of public safety must be examined, catalogued, explained. The people's voices were clear. They would not rest until the chest was opened. But something deeper held him back, something older than law or duty. It was instinct, primal and unshakable. Every fiber of him screamed that the chest was not meant to be touched. The stranger's words echoed in his skull. "If you take it, the blood won't be on my hands." Calder closed his eyes, picturing the faces of his people. Some looked to him with hope, others with fury, but all with expectation. He bore the weight of their lives on his shoulders, and now that weight had a shape, a lock, and a key. If he opened it, he might save them from their own paranoia, or damn them all to something far worse. Hours passed. The night deepened. Outside, coyotes howled at the moon, their cries sharp and mournful. Inside, the jailhouse was still but for Calder's uneven breath. He stood before the chest, the key dangling from his hand, the decision burning in his mind. Behind him, the stranger shifted in his cell, opening his eyes to watch silently. Calder felt the man's gaze on him, heavy as the chest itself. It was not the look of a prisoner to a jailer. It was the look of a man who knew the future, and who knew it could not be stopped. The sheriff's hand trembled. He lifted the key, fitting its jagged edge into the strange lock. The metal scraped against iron, the sound ringing out in the stillness like a church bell. His heart thundered in his chest. The town's fate, the stranger's burden, the law itself all hung on this moment. The key was in his hand, poised to turn, but would he dare? The sound of the lock breaking echoed like a gunshot. The jailhouse was silent when the moment came. Sheriff Calder stood over the chest, his hand steady at last. The jagged key fitted into the lock. For days he had resisted, but resistance had only tightened the noose around the town. Now there was no turning back. The people demanded answers, and he was the man sworn to deliver them. The key turned with a metallic scrape, grinding through grooves that hadn't been touched in years. The lock resisted at first, stiff with age, but then gave way with a sharp crack that shattered the stillness. Outside, the town seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the sheriff felt the weight of history fall on his shoulders. The sound was not just iron breaking. It was a promise breaking, one the stranger had carried in silence across miles of desert. The lid did not spring open. It sagged slowly, as though reluctant, as though the chest itself resisted, revealing its secret. Calder's hand hovered above it, his breath shallow. Behind him, in the cell, the stranger stirred. For the first time in hours, he spoke. "You can't put it back once you've seen it," he murmured. Calder ignored the words, but they burrowed deep. He lifted the lid an inch. A low creak filled the jailhouse, long and drawn out, like a coffin lid protesting its removal. A smell drifted out, faint but unmistakable. Not the stench of rot, but something older, something metallic and earthy, like soil unearthed after too many years underground. The sheriff's stomach clenched. The air thickened. The lamplight flickered, though there was no draft. Shadows shifting across the walls like figures moving in the corner of vision. Calder pulled the lid higher, but stopped halfway. He could not yet see inside, and yet he felt something pressure, like standing too close to a storm. The hair on his arms lifted, his skin prickled. Whatever lay inside was more than metal and wood. From outside came muffled voices. A crowd had gathered at the barred windows, their faces pressed against the glass, their whispers rising. "What's in it? Has he opened it? What do you see?" The townsfolk were straining, desperate, their hunger louder than their fear. Calder felt their weight pressing on him too, demanding truth, demanding release. He raised the lid higher, another inch. The smell grew sharper, richer, filling the room with something cold and foreign. He leaned closer, peering into the shadows within, but the light seemed to bend away, refusing to reveal the contents. His pulse thundered in his ears. Behind him, the stranger's voice came again, hoarse but sharp. "Don't look too long." Calder's hand shook on the lid. He wanted to slam it shut, to end the moment before it began. But the crowd outside roared louder, and his own curiosity burned hotter. He pulled the lid fully open. The chest gaped wide, its interior swallowing the lamplight as though it fed on it. For a long, suffocating moment, he could not see anything. It was as if the chest contained only darkness, deeper than shadow, deeper than night. Then, slowly, shapes began to form. The air inside shimmered, heavy with something unseen, and Calder thought he heard sounds faint, whispering voices that brushed his ears but vanished when he turned his head. He leaned closer. The darkness shifted, catching the light in strange ways, and something glimmered. Not gold, not silver, but dull, like bone polished by time. His throat tightened. The smell grew stronger now, iron-rich, mingled with the dry dust of forgotten places. He thought of graves, of battlefields, of things best left buried. The crowd outside was frantic now, pounding on the walls. "What is it, Sheriff? What do you see?" Their voices mixed into a single demand, a wave that threatened to pull him under. Calder's lips parted, but no words came. He could not describe it. He was not sure language was enough. The stranger rose in his cell, his face pale, his hands gripping the bars. "Close it," he said, "before it takes hold." Calder could not move. His eyes were locked inside, drawn to the shapes that seemed to writhe just beyond the edge of vision. The lamplight flickered lower, shadows crawling across the walls, and the jailhouse groaned as though the very building sensed the intrusion. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to close the chest, to seal away whatever lived inside. But another voice whispered just as loud, the voice of the crowd, the voice of duty, the voice of hunger for truth. He had opened the lock. He had crossed the threshold. To stop now would be to leave the town in worse torment than before. He leaned closer still, the darkness almost touching his skin. The whispers rose again, clearer now, weaving into words that chilled him. They spoke of secrets buried, of promises broken, of fates entwined with blood. His breath caught in his throat, his hand trembling on the lid. Behind him, the stranger shouted, his voice raw, "Sheriff, don't!" But it was too late. Calder's eyes locked on the thing within, and in that instant, he knew the town of Dry Creek would never be the same. What lay inside would not just change lives, it would shatter them. The truth was not treasure, but terror. The jailhouse air was heavy, thick with silence broken only by ragged breaths. The chest stood open, its secret finally laid bare. Sheriff Calder stared down into the darkness within, his eyes fixed on what no man in Dry Creek had expected to see. It was not gold, nor silver, nor anything that could bring fortune. What gleamed in the lamplight was pale, twisted, and unnatural shapes that spoke of death, or worse, of something that had never belonged in the hands of men. A hush fell outside. The crowd that had pressed against the windows waited, holding their breath, sensing that something had shifted in the world inside the jail. Calder's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to name what he had seen, but the words refused him. Some sights did not belong in language. Some truths could not be softened by explanation. Then the smell reached them. It seeped from the chest like a slow tide, iron-rich, bitter, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Those nearest the window gagged, stumbling back. A woman covered her mouth with her shawl, her eyes wide with horror. Murmurs rose, then shouts. "What is it? What's he hiding?" Calder backed away, his legs weak, his hand trembling as it reached for the desk behind him. His revolver lay there, but for the first time in his life, he felt it was useless. No bullet could put down the kind of dread that oozed from the chest. Behind him, the stranger gripped the bars of his cell, his face pale, his voice breaking with urgency. "Now you see," he said. "Now you understand why I never spoke." Calder turned toward him, anger burning through the fear. "You brought this here. You carried it across miles of land, right into the heart of a town. Why?" The man's eyes were haunted, but steady. "Because it has to be carried. Better one man suffer the burden than 100. Better silence than panic." But panic had already arrived. The townsfolk hammered on the jailhouse door now, voices rising in a storm of fear and fury. "Open it! Show us! Tell us what he's been hiding." Some cried that the sheriff was lying, that he meant to keep whatever was inside for himself. Others shouted to burn the chest, to destroy it before its evil seeped further. Calder knew there was no controlling them. The moment he turned the key, he had unleashed not just the secret inside the chest, but the chaos festering in the hearts of his people. He looked back into the box, and the image seared itself deeper into his mind. Were they bones, artifacts, something living once or still? He couldn't decide. Every time he thought he understood the shape, the light shifted, revealing something worse. His stomach turned, bile rising in his throat. Whatever it was not meant for eyes. The stranger's voice cut through again, low but clear. "I begged you not to. You think me guilty, but I was the one keeping it from you, protecting you, because once it's seen, it's carried by everyone, not just me." Calder gripped the edge of the desk, sweat dripping down his temples. The man's words rang true. He felt it in the pit of his chest, in the way his thoughts twisted now, circling the thing in the box like moths to flame. It called to him, demanded to be looked at again, demanded to be named, even as it hollowed him out with dread. The townsfolk pushed harder at the door. A plank cracked. The deputies shouted for order, but their voices were lost in the storm. The people wanted answers, and they would tear down the walls to get them. Calder looked to the stranger. For the first time, he saw not menace but ruin in the man's posture, his silence, his secrecy, his distance. None of it had been cruelty. It had been duty. He had carried a curse across the desert, away from one town after another, so that no place would bear it too long. Dry Creek had only been his latest stop, "You damned fool," Calder muttered, though whether he meant himself or the man in the cell, he did not know. The chest sat open still, its contents stirring the air, warping it. The lamplight sputtered, casting the sheriff's shadow long and thin against the wall. He felt the pressure mounting inside the box, outside the jail, inside his own skull. Then came the sound that broke him. From the chest, faint but undeniable, came a whisper, not imagined this time, but real, curling into the room like smoke. The words were unclear, but the tone was pleading, mournful, inhuman. Calder stumbled back, his revolver in hand now, though he had no target to fire on. The deputies froze, their faces pale, their eyes darting from the sheriff to the box to the barred windows rattling under the townsfolk's fists. Calder's mind raced. He could slam the lid shut, lock it again, and try to bury the truth. But the town had heard enough, the smell, the whispers, the fear in his eyes. They would never let it rest. They would demand to see it, to know it, to own it. And once they did, there would be no going back. The stranger gripped the bars tighter, his voice raw. "Sheriff, you've opened it. You've unleashed it. Now you'll see what happens when fear takes hold of more than just one man." The crowd outside broke through a shudder, their hands reaching inside, their voices shrill with outrage. They would not wait much longer. Calder looked again at the chest, its dark secret yawning open before him, and felt the weight of his failure settle in. He had wanted peace. He had wanted truth. Instead, he had given the town a wound that would never heal. And as the whispers rose and the people closed in, one thought burned in his mind: what happens when fear takes over an entire town? By dawn, the town would never be the same again. The night of the chest stretched longer than any Dry Creek had ever endured. Hours seemed to crawl, each one heavier than the last. The jailhouse, once a symbol of law and order, had become the eye of a storm. Inside, the chest lay open, its secret staining the air. Outside, the crowd surged, their fear feeding on itself until it became fury. When the door finally broke beneath their weight, the people poured in like a flood. They did not stop to hear reason. They wanted to see what had driven their sheriff pale, what had twisted the stranger's silence into a warning. They wanted truth, and truth is rarely kind. Some gagged at the sight, stumbling back into the street with hands pressed to mouths. Others leaned closer, eyes wide, desperate to confirm their suspicions. A few fell to their knees, crossing themselves, whispering prayers into the stale night air. It was not treasure. It was not salvation. It was something that pulled at the darkest corners of their imagination, and each man and woman who saw it carried a different terror away in their heart. The stranger watched from his cell, his hands wrapped white-knuckled around the bars. For the first time since he had entered town, his face was unguarded. Pain etched every line, not for himself, but for them. "I told you," he whispered. "I carried it so you wouldn't have to." But it was too late. The crowd turned on him. Fear is a cruel judge, and in that moment, they saw not a man who had borne their burden, but the one who had cursed them with it. Shouts rose. "Hang him. Drive him out. Make him pay for what he brought here." The mob that had once been neighbors and friends became a beast with one voice, demanding punishment. Sheriff Calder stood frozen. His deputies looked to him for orders, but he had none. He had opened the chest. He had let the secret loose. The stranger might have carried it, but Calder had delivered it into their hands. Still, the weight of the town's fury pressed on him, and he knew the people would not rest until the man was judged. They dragged the stranger from his cell, the crowd surging around him. He did not resist. His feet moved with a grim steadiness, as though he had walked this path before. They pulled him into the square, beneath the wide desert sky where the stars seemed dimmer than they had the night before. A rope was thrown over a beam, rough hands pulling it tight. Calder pushed through the crowd, shouting for calm, but his voice was swallowed in the roar. The stranger met his eyes, calm, even in the chaos. "It doesn't matter what they do to me," he said quietly. "The chest is open now. The burden is theirs." The sheriff's chest ached with the truth of it. He wanted to stop them, to drag the man back, to undo the night's choices. But he also knew the town would not forgive Silence again. If he protected the stranger, they would tear him down as well. So he stood there, his fists clenched, his badge heavy on his chest. As the rope tightened, the man's body hung still against the pale light of dawn, a grim silhouette that cast a shadow over the crowd. Silence fell. For a moment, it seemed the town had found its justice. But justice is not peace. In the days that followed, Dry Creek unraveled. Families packed wagons and left, unable to sleep beneath the same sky that had seen the chest open. Others stayed, but they spoke less, laughed less, trusting neither neighbors nor strangers. Business faltered, friendships ended, and the once steady rhythm of life was broken. The chest itself was gone. Calder and his deputies buried it deep in the desert, miles from town, marking no grave, leaving no trail. But though the chest was hidden, its shadow remained. The people had seen too much. They carried it now in their eyes, in their silence, in the way they flinched at sudden noises, and whispered when night fell. Sheriff Calder bore it worst of all. He carried the memory of the stranger's stare, of the man who had begged them not to look, not to know. He carried the sound of the lock breaking, the whispers rising, the sight that no longer left his dreams. He bore the knowledge that he, sworn to protect, had been the one to unleash what should have stayed sealed. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Calder sat alone in his office, the lamplight flickering low, and wondered if the chest still lay where they had buried it or if it waited, patient, to be found again. He wondered if another town, years from now, would face the same curse, and he wondered if his choice had been justice or damnation. Dry Creek lived on, but it was not the same town. Its people no longer spoke of the chest aloud, but their silence was heavier than words. Children grew up hearing fragments, whispered warnings, half-remembered truths, and every man and woman carried a piece of that night, buried deep but never gone. And so the story of Dry Creek ended not with peace, but with a question that would linger long after its people were gone. Had the sheriff delivered justice, or had he cursed them all? If this tale left you unsettled, imagine what waits in the next one. What do you think was truly inside that chest curse? Crime, or something beyond this world? Share your theory below. I read every one. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next dark secret from the Wild West.